Now I'm officially ready to get started. So let me open this up in presentation mode, and then I will share my screen. Let me know if you can see this okay. I will bring up the comments here. Okay. So let me know if you could see this okay, and then we will get started. All right. So how to grow your show with podcast swaps. Looking to start a podcast. Oh, I've got comments coming in already. Looking to start a podcast and help non-tech founders build startups. That sounds great, Gareth. Chris is saying can see okay. Gareth is saying we can see it. And then if I'm looking at the monitor, yeah, things are looking good there as well. So tell me if I'm a big Friends fan. I'm an elder millennial. And so I love Friends. I was in Friends camp. I was not in Seinfeld camp, though. I've grown to appreciate Seinfeld as well. In season 1, there was an episode, or 2 episodes really, called The One with Two Parts. And there was the one with 2 parts, part 1, and the one with 2 parts, part 2. In the one with 2 parts, part 1, the stars of Mad About You, including Helen Hunt, who you see in the screenshot here, made an appearance on Friends because Lisa Kudrow who played Phoebe, pictured in the as the woman holding the yellow cup there, also played Ursula on Mad About You. She was the very bad waitress at the diner they would go to. And so in canon, in Friends and Mad About You canon, Phoebe and Ursula were sisters. And so the gals from Mad About You stopped into Central Perk, and they did a crossover episode that way. The guys from Friends also went to the diner and mistook Ursula for Phoebe. But the point here is that the stars of Mad About You, which led into Friends, went on Friends. But it didn't stop there. In the one with 2 parts, part 2, the guys from ER, Noah Weil and George Clooney, made an appearance on Friends as well. Now, they weren't their characters because ER took place in Chicago and Friends took place in New York. But the stars were on the show nonetheless. And while Friends, I don't think, led directly into ER, at least not at this point, Seinfeld did, and then ER was on, right? So on must-see TV Thursday nights, we had Mad About You, we had Friends, we had Seinfeld, and we had ER. Which means that if people were fans of all of those shows, or if they were fans of Mad About You and ER, they were probably going to watch this 2-episode arc. And in fact, I did have a trailer here, which I don't know why that's not showing up anymore. But I had a trailer here that basically showcased this. So let me bring that up really quick. And if you have any questions in the meantime, I'm happy to answer them so far. Right now, I'm just telling you about Friends. But there was this on you can find this on YouTube. There was a promo for Thursday night must-see TV. And so let me
On an all-new Mad About You, Jamie leaves Paul home alone.
Well, now it's all mine.
And it's the biggest Friends ever with guest Helen Hunt.
Hi, it's us.
Plus, Joey falls for Phoebe's twin.
Everyone always thought of her as the pretty one.
And check it out, the Hunts from ER date the girl.
I use my breasts to get attention. We both do that.
And on an all-new Seinfeld, Jerry, a doorman.
Yeah.
And Kramer, a mugger.
Is that all you got, fat boy?
Plus, an all-new ER NBC Thursday.
Okay, so the whole point, all of that illustration, all of that story, is to show you that the way that these big TV shows, used the same strategy, right? So Chris is saying back in the 90s, I never missed Thursday nights on NBC. I mean, it was must-see TV. I was a 10 in 1995. But later on, 97, 98, like Friends was my first sitcom. And so likewise, Chris. And I remember when Friends ended in 2003, sitting in my dorm room, skipping anything that was going on campus that day, because I wanted to make sure I caught the finale of Friends before TiVo and streaming were a thing. So let's see how it worked out for them. This is the Friends season 1 viewership, and I've highlighted a few things here. Their most popular episode before February 23rd, 1995, which was the one with 2 parts. Their most popular episode aired on January 5th, and this was called The One with Mrs. Bing, where Morgan Fairchild was a guest star. So again, similar thing, right? They got a big star, people tuned in, but no other show came even close to that. For The One with 2 parts and every one after, they all outperformed the rest of the season, with those 2 being the best performing until the season finale. So the guest swaps, I'll call them, right? Or the guest star cameos worked. Podcasters can leverage this same strategy. You can look for lookalike audiences and get them by working with other similar podcasts. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So the goal for this webinar is to show you 4 podcast outreach strategies too. Chris, I just saw your comment on the other channel as well. Thanks for being a subscriber to both channels. I appreciate that. The goal of this webinar, show 4 podcast swap strategies, find podcasts to swap with, and then I'm going to show you a simple outreach strategy that I implemented. And you'll get some templates and how it all works. So by the end of this, you'll have some fun stuff and you'll have the tools you need to grow your podcast, right? Because let's face it, podcasting has an organic discovery problem. I saw a presentation recently that talked about how if you want to be discovered, podcasting is a terrible medium. And at first, I really wanted to fight that notion. I didn't think it was true. I thought podcasting is great for discovery, but then I thought about it a little bit more and, sorry, that was a zoom for effect there. I thought about it a little bit more and I thought podcast discovery is really hard. What podcasting is great for is getting people to trust you better, but the organic discovery problem is because there's not something like YouTube for podcasts. YouTube is getting into podcasting, but there's not a single place where people can go and search for something and get a list of podcast episodes. And then there's no recommendation engine for other episodes like the one you just listened to. There are tools that try, but again, it's very, let's say, decentralized. There's no one true source for that. So that is the organic discovery problem. And that's why podcast swaps are so important, because just like, again, I don't want to belabor this point about television, but the only way that people knew what was on television back then was if they subscribed to the TV Guide and read the TV Guide cover to cover, or if they scoured the information channel guide channel, right? Which again, like, you're actively looking for that stuff. But there was nothing recommending new shows, which is why they had to do these swaps, right? Netflix and HBO Max and all these other streamers today, they're like, hey, if you watch this, you'll love this. But podcasting doesn't have anything like that right now. So let's talk about podcast swaps and 4 types of podcast swaps. First of all, podcast swaps are a strategy to get your show in front of other audiences with the goal of getting more listeners. This is your goal. expose your show to people who you know listen to podcasts already. Our goal is to get current podcast listeners listening to your show, not to get new people listening to podcasts for the first time. And there are 4 ways to do this, right? There's podcast swaps, which is the title of this, but I'm using it as a blanket term. There's a more specific term for podcast swaps. There's podcast swaps, feed drops, interview exchange, and crossover episodes. So let's walk through each of these. Podcast swaps. You and another host promote each other. So I'll say me and my friend Matt have similar podcasts. We say, hey, let's do a podcast swap. I give him some bullet points about my podcast. He gives me some bullet points about his podcast. And then in the beginning of the show, I say, hey, real quick before we get started, I want to tell you about this great podcast called The Matt Report. I think it's Matt talks to the blue collar digital worker. And I think it's really similar to this show because where I talk to creators about this and that and whatever. And I give a shining endorsement to that podcast. The goal for you is to either have a clear URL or call to action. The call to action is going to probably be, you can find it right now in your podcast app of choice. But I like to say that, or visit howibuilt.it/subscribe, right? Or profitablepodcaster.fm, right? You'll find subscribe buttons there. But most people are going to go through and use the podcast app they're using to listen to the current podcast to then find your podcast. So that's podcast swaps. They're basically host-read ad spots for your podcast. And I would recommend that you treat the swap as an ad spot. And so maybe you're losing ad money. Maybe you didn't fulfill all of the ads. Maybe you don't have ads. But the goal here is to grow your podcast by doing this. And you don't want it to get mixed up in your own call to action, or if you have a full slate of sponsors or you're promoting other stuff, you want to have a certain number of promos, and you should reserve one of those for podcast swaps if you're going to do them often. I would also say to do one podcast per episode. Don't do 4 podcast swaps in an episode, right? It's not like a podcast links roundup. You can do that too if you want. But have one podcast that you're talking about per episode. The next thing is feed drops. So you and another host exchange episodes. I tried this and it was pretty cool. I think it worked pretty well on my end. I don't know how it did for the other podcaster, but basically you drop a full episode in your feed and they drop one of your full episodes in their feed. So what I recommend doing is getting the raw audio. I try to send the audio without ads, because I don't think it's right to put my advertisers in their feed, right? Like maybe they have advertisers, whatever. So I try to send the ad-free version, which I can do because I have a members only version. But what you should do here is take their audio, add your own bumper to it. So say, hey, everybody, today's episode is a little different. It's actually an episode of the Good People, Cool Things podcast. And in this episode, the host, Joey Held, talks to Jessie, I forget what her name was, her last name, about this and that, how she went from working outdoors on the farm to doing digital work. And I really like it for these reasons, right? And so you talk about those things, and then you say, without further ado, here's the episode. And then at the end, you come back and you say something like, hey, I hope you really liked that episode. If you want to get more Good People, Cool Things, you can subscribe in your podcast app of choice or head over to goodpeoplecoolthings.com, whatever. So add your own bumpers there and promote the show, right? And hopefully the host does the same thing for you. Maybe define that, right? The other host should do the same thing for you. And I say release it on an off day or not. So my original intention was to make this kind of a bonus episode in the feed. So my episodes come out on Monday. Maybe this would be a Wednesday or Thursday episode, but I got very sick and I decided to make that episode the episode for the week. And then I did another thing I'd never done before in the following week, which was a re-air of an older episode, which did great. So I used to say release on an off day. Do what works best for you, right? If you want to make it the main episode that week, if it's core to your mission, which it should be, we'll talk about that later, then great. Do that. It's your show. Do what you want. So I would say like conventional wisdom has been to release it on an off day, but you don't have to do that. You don't have to do that. All right, interview exchange. So this is you and another host interview each other, and you're going to do this one for each show. So you're making 2 episodes, right? So this is maybe the most work, but you're going to do 2 episodes, one where you interview the other host, and then one where the other host interviews you. And the benefit of this is it allows each of you to go deep on topics you know your audience cares about, while also getting the other host more in front of your audience, right? So if I were to do a podcast swap with, again, my friend Matt, I might interview him on how being a digital worker has changed in the last 10 years and the emergence of no code, because he talks about that a lot. He might interview me on what it's like going from developer to creator, right? Maybe that's interesting to his audience. And then we each have the opportunity to then go and promote our shows on that show. So this is an interview exchange. You and another host interview each other. It allows you to get deeper. It is a little bit more work because now you're creating 2 episodes. On that same token, or in that same vein, similarly, you could do a crossover episode. And this is where you and another host record 1 episode together. I had a whole LinkedIn post on this, but it's 1 recording for both shows. And so you just record the episode and add the bumpers in later, and you can each add in your own bumpers. So I did this with my friend Nathan. We had a debate on whether or not virtual summit speakers should be paid. I think they should. Nathan runs a virtual summit where he doesn't pay his speakers, and he made the argument why it could be unfeasible for speakers to get paid. So we did the interview once, we took the raw audio, and then we recorded our own bumpers where we promoted the other host's show and released it. There are a lot of cool things that you can do with this one in particular. If the host you're pitching is interested, you can do a debate, right? Because if you're similar shows, then you might have differing opinions on something within your niche. So you could do a debate, you could do a listicle of sort, or a draft. I love the draft idea for podcasts where you pick something and then you go back and forth, right? Maybe it's we're going to build the perfect podcast site. And then each of you pick an audio host, and each of you pick a website service, and each of you pick an editor or whatever. So you could do stuff like that, or you can do shared experiences, right? Where you tell like your biggest horror story of a podcast sponsor, or the time you released a membership and only 1 person bought, and now you're on the hook. So a crossover episode could be really cool. It could allow your audience to get a different perspective. And then, of course, it puts you in front of other audiences. So that's the 4. If we go back, podcast swaps, feed drops, interview exchanges, and crossover episodes. I think doing a mix of these 4 is the way to go. That way, it's not just constantly you promoting a podcast. It allows you to mix up the content a little bit. And it allows you to experiment with formats and viewpoints. So it creates better content for you as well. And you're probably thinking, like, Joe, this is great. Sure. I'd love to do 1 million podcast swaps, 1 a week, right? But how do I find podcasts to swap with? Do I just swap with any podcast who will accept me? The answer to that is no. You need to be strategic with the podcasts you're swapping with. Because again, if we look at the Friends crossover episode, first of all, it didn't swap with like a competing Fox show, right? I don't know what was on Fox at 8:30 p.m. on Thursdays. I actually can't tell you what any other channel had on Thursday nights. I could tell you that ABC had Friday nights on lockdown. But they weren't doing that because they wanted the audience, but they wanted lookalike audiences. And they knew the demographics for Mad About You, and they knew the demographics for ER, and they thought it would be a good idea to cross-pollinate these shows and get fans of Mad About You looking at Friends, because they're both lighthearted sitcoms, usually about 20 to 30 somethings trying to make it in the big city. And ER, yeah, that's a drama, right? Maybe that's not necessarily a sitcom, but it's still about young professionals trying to balance work and life. And maybe people who are into funny 20-something situations will be into dramatic 20-something situations, right? And it didn't just work with Friends. It worked with Law and Order, like like Homicide. Richard Belzer was on Homicide, did a crossover episode with Law and Order, and then became a regular on Law and Order SVU, right? So this is a strategy that works as long as you find the right audience. You need to be strategic. So how do you be strategic? Again, it's all about borrowing lookalike audiences. You want to find people who are very similar to your listeners, who have the same values as your listeners, who are trying to solve the same problem as your listeners, and get them to come over to your show. So how do you do that? You look for podcasts that solve the same problem, right? Let me know in the comments, what is the problem that your podcast solves? Because if you don't know that, that's the first thing you need to define. So let me know. Gareth already said, right, he wants to help non-tech founders build startups. So the startup world is very techie focused. He wants to help non-techie people become founders, and create startups. So the problem he's solving is closing the knowledge gap between founders who don't have a technical background and the technical background knowledge that you need to be a successful startup founder. So let me know in the comments what problem your podcast solves. You want to serve a similar audience. So if you serve podcasters, you want to find other podcasts that serve podcasters. If you serve creators, you want to find other podcasts that serve creators. If you serve people who run arts and craft stores, you want to find other podcasts that serve crafty people. Number 3, if you don't exactly know the avatar or the audience and what they look like, look for podcasts that have a host similar to you in situation and lot in life, right? So I might look for podcasts with other podcast coaches as hosts, because we're probably talking about something similar, but maybe they focus specifically on marketing your podcast. And I'm not a marketing expert. I'm more of a process, automations, monetization guy. So we have some crossover there. Look for podcasts that your listeners also listen to. I'll show you how to do that in a minute. And then look for podcasts that have products you use as a sponsor. So let's say you're a big fan of ConvertKit. Try to see what podcasts ConvertKit is sponsoring, because they are likely trying to reach the same audience you're trying to reach. So reach out to those podcasts and say, hey, I suspect that we have similar audiences. I would love I don't know if you've considered podcast swaps, but I'd love to do one. So let's talk about 4, really 5 places where you can find podcasts to swap with. The first is Tink Media's podcast swap list. The second is Apple Podcasts. The second is the Podcast Community Discord run by Ari Nissenblatt. And the fourth is Niche Podcast Directories. So Tech Brood is coming in the chat saying cover new tech for Soho. Is that Soho, like Soho, like New York City? Or is that Solo? And quick tech tips on hardware and software. But maybe move focus to Linux and open source using Nextcloud. So this is great. Shifting, pivoting is, I've done it multiple times, but let's bring this one up on the screen because I think it's really interesting. Cover new tech for Soho Business. I'm gonna guess solo, but maybe you're a locally focused podcast and that's cool too. Quick tech tips on hardware and software, but maybe move focus to Linux and open source. So this is great. People, your people, right? So maybe, oh man, there's a podcast. I think it's called Tech My Ride. Small office and home office. Soho. I didn't know that. I learned something today. Soho is an acronym. Small office and home office. Love that. I think that's fantastic and a really good niche. So maybe like Tech My Ride, it would be a good podcast to swap with, right? Because they're covering the news of the day, right? Or maybe Gareth is somebody, not that I'm trying to put anybody on the spot here, but you two seem to have maybe similarly focused podcasts. So this is great. So you want to find Tech Brood, you want to find podcasts that do something similar, right? So maybe you focus on Linux and open source. Maybe you want to find podcasts that are talk about maybe like hosting environments or Docker. Now I'm just throwing out hosting things that I don't really know that much about. But I think you get the idea here. So that's a really cool niche. I like that a lot. All right. So, my favorite thing here when I move away from the full screen mode. Okay. So let's talk about each of these. The first is Tink Media's podcast promo swap list. I'll have a link, a slide with links in a minute, and I'll send these links in the follow-up email after. So if you're like tuning in on YouTube, and you haven't, if you're tuning in on YouTube, but you haven't registered, you should probably do that. So I'll drop a link, to that in the chat. Podlift.me.com/webinar swaps. So if you want to get like the links and the special offer that's coming later, be sure to grab that. Okay. So Tink Media. I love this because it's opt-in. So as a podcaster, you can have yourself added to the list and you have access to this Airtable base of other people who are actively looking for podcast swaps, guest interview swaps, and things like that. So you can go through, you can look at the downloads, and this also has the contact information, that's harder to find. And we'll talk about that in a minute, but that's, I think, what makes this resource so valuable is because it puts a lot of information front and center for you. So this is where I would start because you're getting audiences, number of episodes, average downloads, and who to talk to. This is a warm list of people that you can reach out to. And this is how I found 20 podcasts to work with. Number 2 is Apple Podcasts. If you go to your podcast, scroll down to the bottom, you'll see a section called You Might Also Like. This is people who have listened to your show, who also happens to listen to these shows. So you can see like there's TED After Hours, there's Talks at Google. There is a Chinese technology podcast. My podcast is big in China for some reason. And so, and I'll say as a quick aside, I asked Apple about this. I was like, is this accurate? Because I'm like an English language only podcast. And they're like, yep, this is based on our metrics. This is correct. So, I mean, if Apple Podcasts is saying it, I guess it's true. Anyway, but so you have podcasts here. And I want you to take note that the creator is listed here. So the name of the host. And then there's also a show website. This is going to come up later. If there's nothing in the You Might Also Like area, look at bigger podcasts that are similar to yours, right? So if there was nothing here, I might go to Pat Flynn's Smart Passive Income or Guy Raz's How I Built This to see if there are similar lookalike audiences listed there. Number 3 is Ari Nissenblatt's podcasting community Discord. This is a great place for podcasters to network, but there is I'm going to say room. It could be channel. I don't know the terminology for Discord, which I'm very sorry about, but I keep mixing it up. But anyway, there's a swaps and collabs, I'm going to say channel, in the podcasting community Discord. So again, these are people who are opting in to be like, hey, I am interested in doing a podcast swap. Here's what my show looks like. Let me know if you want in. Again, I'll have a link to that in a second. And then you have these niche podcast sites. So this is Podchaser. There, excuse me. There's also Good Notes. I'm getting a little choked up talking about this. There's Good Pods, which is like a Goodreads for podcasts. There's Listen Notes, and there's a few others. I think Acast might have bought Podchaser is what it is. But in either way, these like kind of niche podcast sites probably also have a similar or community section. Listen Notes has a community section, which will list based on however they do it, however they measure engagement, similar looking podcasts to yours. So this is a list. There's 95 here for how I built it, right? So that's a lot more than the 4 that was listed in Apple Podcasts. So again, this is a chance for you to go through and look for possible podcasts to swap with. Notice that there's also the creator section, right? There's going to be host information somewhere on these sites, so you can at least get the host's name or a podcast website, and that's going to be crucial in a minute. So again, those are the 4. If we rewind, Tink Media's podcast swap list, which I think is the best when you're starting because it has all the information ready for you to go. Apple Podcast, which is been around for a long time. And I'll say like you can use like Apple Podcast and Spotify's like category lists, but the idea is to find pretty targeted podcasts that have lookalike audiences. And then there's the podcast community Discord. Again, this is a place for you to connect directly with other podcasters, and niche podcast directories. And here are the links. So if you want to take a screenshot of that and grab it, I know if you use a Mac, you can take a screenshot and then just highlight the text. But again, I'll send these links and the slides in a follow-up email. All right. So now it's time to act, right? I've told you the what. I've told you the how a little bit, like how to find podcasts. Now let's talk about the outreach and how you find the information for these podcasters, right? How do you find email addresses? What do you say? So here are some quick tips on how to find a contact. First of all, Tink Media and Discord, like I said, make this very easy because the information is listed right there. You'll have a name and an email address. The only thing for the Tink Media database, I would caution to make sure that, because this has been going on for a while, I don't know if it's updated at all or if people say like remove me. You want to make sure that the podcasts there are active. I accidentally reached out to a couple because I didn't check this. I accidentally reached out to a couple that had not published new episodes in a year. And so I look like a dum-dum because I said like, oh, I found your show and I think it's great. And I will say like I did listen to a recent episode. I just didn't check the date on that recent episode. You can also look for an email address on other directories. So what I mean here, right, is Podchaser, Listen Notes, Good Pods, they might have contact information. Or they might have a website that has a contact form. So you can look for it that way. Apple Podcasts doesn't make this available. And more podcast hosts are removing the email address from the feed because that has been a source of spam. But look for other places to reach out to a host. And then if all else fails, you can look up the host on LinkedIn or other social media and slide into their DMs there. That's worked with and for me. I'll usually go to LinkedIn first and do a quick search, see if like the picture of the host on the podcast website matches the picture on LinkedIn. And then I'll reach out via DM and I'll say like, hey, I'll do the pitch. Which, by the way, what do you say in the pitch? Maybe you're just here for the template. Well, here you go. Here's what I said in a successful podcast swap. Hi, my name is Joe Casabona, and I found Name of Podcast through Tink Media's podcast swap database. We can switch this and say like, I found your podcast through Apple Podcasts, and I think we have similar audiences or whatever. My show, How I Built It, is similar to yours. Now I was wondering if you'd be up for a guest swap or feed swap. How I built it, and then information about the show, information about the audience. I want to put that up front because if my audience doesn't align with theirs or they don't think that, then this is all for naught. And then if you want to do a guest swap, I tell them a little bit about me and how they can find more information about me. So let's break this down. First, up here, where I found you. This is really important, right? Because if they, especially, oh my God, I wrote Think Media. I can't believe I did that. It didn't. I just noticed this typo now, and I wrote that email a bunch of times, first of all, and I made these slides just now. So I can't believe I just said that. I can't believe I just noticed this. But you know what? Even with the typo in probably several of these pitches, I still got to work with like 15 out of the 20 I reached out to. So anyway, Tink Media's podcast swap database. This is where I found you. You want to let them know, right? Because you want to tell them if you found them through like a warm lead or if you're just kind of taking a shot in the dark. Either one is fine, right? I found you on Apple Podcasts. I think we have similar audiences. And then right here, I wonder if you'd be up for, this is going to take a little bit of research. So let me tell you, I changed the pitch, like the what they'd be up for depending on the audience. For some people, I offered a guest or feed swap. For some people, I only offered a promo swap. And for some people, I just pitched myself as a guest. I didn't know if, I didn't think that their show really aligned with my audience as much as my expertise aligned with theirs. So for some people, I just pitched myself as a guest. And this is important because in Tink Media, some will just say I'm just looking for guests, right? But the important bit here is to think about what you think will work best for them. A feed swap, I'll tell you, I didn't feel work for most podcasts that I reached out to, but for this one, I think it totally did because we were both talking to creators and he had some really interesting guests. I thought it would be cool. So this is the anatomy of the pitch. Again, if you are on the list, if you're on the mailing list, if you registered for this and you're not just watching it on YouTube right now, I will send you like a Google Doc with this template. And I'll say that all of my resources are available in the Podcast Liftoff playbook. So this and then a couple of other things that we'll talk about. So once you have who you're going to reach out to and what you're going to say, then you need to track outreach. So this is a mostly blurred document because I don't know how many people who are still on this list who want their information out there, but the Tink Media list is an Airtable base. So I made my own copy of the Airtable base and I added 2 fields to it. Reached out and bad fit. And I looked at every single one. This is going to take some time, not necessarily time a VA, not necessarily time that a VA could spend well, right? Because this is mostly like a judgment call. I mean, I should say I don't think it would be a good task for my VA. Maybe your VA is more like a virtual office manager or something like that. Anyway, so this takes some time, but I went through and I basically looked at the categories. So if they were a bad category, I just didn't look at them. I looked at the title. So if it was a title that was really out there and I figured that it wasn't part of my niche, I marked them as a bad fit. And then any that I didn't mark as a bad fit, I had filtered. And so I had just a view of the podcast I was reaching out to. And as I reached out to them, I ticked them off the list so I wouldn't accidentally reach out to them again. The beauty of this is that I can go in and see how much the Tink Media database has changed. And then I can combine these two so that I'm not constantly reaching out to the same podcasts all the time. And again, this is an Airtable. I love Airtable. I use it for everything. And so when I do my next round of outreach, I'm definitely going to use this system again. And it's not like a crazy amount of automation, right? I could make it so that when I check reached out, Airtable sends out an email. But again, this is about relationship building. This is not a ton of cold outreach. And so I want to make sure that when I do the pitch, it makes sense for them, and it has to be a win-win for everybody, for both of you. So again, this template is available in the Podcast Liftoff Playbook. So that's everything I had to say about podcast swaps. But now, if you'll indulge me, I do want to mention that podcast swaps are only part, or I should say discovery is only part of the battle. My mission is to help podcasters become profitable. And discovery is only part of that journey. Podcasting feels like a marathon you're sprinting. It feels like a time suck sometimes. It feels like you're yelling into the void, that you're wasting money, that you're stagnating, right? Because you launch and you just have 10 downloads every week, and then like you have 5 devices. So you're getting like you 5 times and then your mom. And it feels like it's hard to do well. And those are all things that are not conducive to a profitable podcast. But it doesn't have to feel that way. Really, Obi-Wan, it doesn't have to. I'm being more earnest here than Jango Fett is in this scene. This is why I created the Podcast Liftoff Playbook. This is a video library. I like to call it the masterclass or the Netflix of profitable podcasting videos. It's a self-paced library of videos where you can go look for the topic you want to learn on and watch all of those videos. There are also collections. So if you do want to take a course in order, that's available to you as well. And I cover topics like discoverability, automation, how to launch a podcast. That's the first course that you'll see there. How to get sponsored. And you have access to all of my resources. So my sponsor pitch templates, my podcast swap pitch templates, my automation library, and lots more. There hours, and in December I added 5 or 6 hours of content alone on top of everything that was already there. So again, this is everything you get. You get these videos, you can see in the collections over here that these are, self-paced courses in order. You get videos, you get templates for checklists, and my automation library. Here's a look at some of the automations in my automation library. And you know what? This is going to get a big update soon because I just switched from Zapier to Make, formerly Integromat. But you have a bunch of automations I've already built. This is Zapier. There's Text Expander. There's Hazel. There is a lot of stuff here that will make your life as a podcaster a lot easier. And then there's walkthroughs of tools like Riverside and Calendly and how I've made my guest outreach automation. And again, this is going to free up hours and hours of your time, because it has for me. I went from spending like 10 hours a week or 20 hours some weeks on podcasting to spending 4 to 5 hours a month on podcasting. And most of that has to do with the actual interview. But that's not all. If you, there are 2 levels, and if you get the extended playbook, you'll also get your very own page, because we'll get a coaching call together, and you will get things that I recommend for you. You'll get recommended plays. So instead of having to sift through all of the content or use the search, we'll meet, and then I'll tell you these are the plays I think will be the most impactful for you right now. This comes part and parcel with the Podcast Liftoff Playbook. So with the extended playbook, you get live cohorts, you get one-on-one coaching, and you get priority email support. So you'll get your own inbox where you can send me a message and I'll respond. I say 72 hours, but it's like really like 24 business hours as long as I'm not away, and you'll get notice when I'm away. But that's not even everything. This is something I'm really excited about. I think podcast swaps are things that can really help. I doubled my monthly downloads in a year, less than that, doing podcast swaps. My sponsor, my episodes, my podcast is sponsored in full until May, thanks to growing my podcast and doing podcast swaps. So starting February 1st, I'm doing a swap accountability cohort. It's a 4-week cohort where we meet weekly to discuss tactics and provide accountability for growing our podcast. Week 1 will be perfecting our pitch. You'll get feedback from me. And then finding podcasts. We'll actually do this live. We'll look at some podcasts and I'll find some to reach out to as well as the contact information. Week 2, we'll do a podcast swap case study. It'll be mine or someone else's if they volunteer. And then the accountability check-in. We'll look at 3 experiments that I'm trying that I didn't mention here. Things that I don't think are ready for prime time yet, but I'm trying out. And I'll let you know how they're going, and an accountability check-in. And then week 4, we'll report on our results so far and what the next steps are. People will be able to get this for $199, right? They'll be able to opt into this swap for $199, like $199. Or if they're part of the extended playbook, they'll get it. But for you, I have a special offer as a thank you for attending this webinar. So you will get the podcast liftoff playbook at $70 off any level, right? So that's the core playbook or the extended playbook, which has the one-on-one coaching call, the unlimited access, and really the cohorts. The cohorts are going to extended playbook only this year. And then you'll also get access to the podcast swap cohort. So it's a 4-week program, hands-on experience, experiments, accountability, a $199 value you'll get for free if you go to podcastliftoff.com/swap. So if you go there, it'll have a table that looks just like this, and it'll automatically apply your $70 off coupon, and you will automatically get put into the podcast swap cohort. Act now, because this offer expires on Saturday. That's Saturday, January 21st. That's also when this replay goes away. So if you want to watch this replay, it's going into the playbook on Saturday, and it'll only be available there. So again, this is the best deal that I currently offer for the podcast liftoff playbook. It's $70 off, and you get the cohort for free. You'll get access to every video I've ever made about podcasting, my automation library, and all of the tools in my tool belt for making me a profitable podcaster. You will get those too. Okay, so that's it. That's everything. Thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate it. And the last thing, does anybody have any questions about podcast swaps? I know that there's a little bit of a tape delay here, so I will give it a few minutes while I wait for the chat to catch up. And then if there are any questions, I will answer them however long it takes. And if there are none, then I will leave you to go on your merry way. But thank you so much, Tech Brood. Thanks so much for attending. I hope you found this helpful. I really appreciate you coming. Again, I was really excited to deliver this webinar because I can't express how successful podcast swaps have been for me. All right. So it looks like the feed is just catching up. So I am watching it over here. So I know there's like a minute delay, it looks like. So really, I'm just vamping for nobody right now. So I'll wait a couple minutes to see if there are any more questions. And otherwise, I'll leave you on your merry way. check my inbox while we wait for this. You doing this? Oh, jeez. That wasn't really for me. I'd like to learn about sponsorships. All right, Chris. Like to learn about sponsorships. So this webinar is really focused on podcast swaps. There is, as in recruiting sponsors. Yeah, that makes sense. This podcast or this podcast, this webinar is really about podcast swaps. There is a lot of information in the playbook about pitching sponsors, and how to find sponsors within your niche. So that's definitely a webinar I have planned for the future, because I get a lot of questions about that. But if you want that info today, there's a whole multi-video section for sponsors, and then there's also my pitch templates and my email templates. So I mean, honestly, I think between me and you, I think that like is the value of the playbook right there. If you get one sponsor, you've paid for the playbook. Something I didn't say actually is that's not a yearly thing. That's a one-time fee. So you pay once and you have access as long as the playbook exists. So that's something else to consider, right? It's a one-time thing. But anyway, all right. So I think the feed has caught up at this point. Chris, thanks for your question. Tech Brood, thanks for coming. Gareth, if you're still here, I really appreciate you joining in. Thanks for everybody who lurked but didn't comment. And you'll get an email with this replay if you want to watch it until Saturday. And again, that URL is podcastliftoff.com/swap. Thanks so much. And until next time, hey, I can't wait to see what you make.